Welcome to State of the State. I'm John Carlevale, hosting this show, and my guest happens to be another host of State of the State who will be serving both host and guest this evening. Welcome to State of the State, Dick.
John, it's very good to be here. I think this is the third time you and I have done this format. And I would like to, as you say, begin the host, because I'm going to ask you a few questions, because 33 years ago today, three gentlemen had an idea and started taping a program called State of the State. 33 years, John, and of course, you are the surviving member. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the three of you who started it, and really, why did you guys decide to start State of the State?
Well, Dick, to be accurate, there were four founders.
Okay.
And they are Bob Plant, Joe Devine, and Don Gill, and myself. Mm-hmm. And we started State of the State in 1991, mm-hmm. in the middle of the beginning of the credit union crisis. And the reason that we started is that we were not getting sufficient information from our elected officials as to what was going on with the credit union. And there were over 175,000 members of the various credit unions, and their money was held with no access to them. So we began, actually, before State of the State TV, we began a radio program to communicate with the members of the credit unions. And then we established a second radio program. But it was Don Gill who said to me one day, "John, the radio is not enough. We really need to start a TV program."
What were you on public radio, or what radio format?
A number of the radio stations who had members in their radio stations that were members of the credit union. So they gladly gave us time, because we would bring the owners of these closed credit unions up to date with what was going on, because our elected officials were either failing to do that or not doing a very good job of it.
Mm-hmm. And I think, I'm sure some people watching this broadcast have no idea what happened in the credit union crisis.
That's right.
So I think it's important for people to understand that when Bruce Sunland was inaugurated as governor, the first act that he did was come out and say, "I'm closing the credit unions," not because the credit unions failed, but because RISDIC, which was the company that insured the deposits, had gotten into trouble. And so he closed all of the credit unions. And I can now, much time has passed, I can share with you, I was a newly hired loan workout officer at Fleet Bank at the time. And we had brought in a couple of gentlemen from the FDIC, mm-hmm. supervisors, and the Sunland administration called over and they said, "Hey, have you got anybody over there you could loan us to help with this?" And so one of the guys was a supervisor out of the San Francisco office of the FDIC. And they would actually shuttle go to the Fleet headquarters, and then they'd go up to Smith Hill. And this guy came back, and he'd come back in the afternoon. He mm-hmm. shook his head. He said, "These guys have no idea what they're doing." Now, you say people weren't finding out. He said, literally, they have no idea what they're doing.
Yes.
And he said, quick looking at this, a lot of these credit unions didn't have to be closed.
All of them, except three, maybe four, could have been remained open.
Yes, right. So that's, when you say people don't find out about what's going on, a lot of times I think it's by design. As much as politicians and elected officials like to talk about transparency, And we're experiencing that today. Just before we went on the air, we were discussing the situation with the bridge over there on the east side.
Yes.
And will we ever find out the real story? I mean, how did this thing deteriorate so rapidly, and why didn't somebody see it before? You just don't know. But so you started it to really convey information about the credit union crisis so that people would probably get a better view of what's going on and become informed. Okay. But obviously we've changed over the years.
Well, that was the beginning, and once we got beyond the credit union crisis, when the money was placed on hold, and that's a lot of detail which we don't need to go over. But and then we really began to make a commitment to tell the story of Rhode Island in terms of its political mindset, and also in terms of its history, because Dick, but unfortunately many Rhode Islanders do not know the wonderful history that we have. And one of the things that I always mention about Rhode Island history is, if it weren't for the members of the Rhode Island contingency at the convention to create our guiding principles, we would not have had what, Dick?
Constitution.
We would not have had the Constitution, but more importantly, we would have not had a Bill of Rights. Rhode Island insisted on a Bill of Rights before it would sign up.
Yep, because actually Rhode Island did not send a representative to the Constitutional Convention. George Washington kind of intervened, and that's right. The quid pro quo was, okay, we'll sign up, but we have to have this Bill of Rights to protect certain rights which are God-given. In other words, we don't get these rights in the bill as much. We can talk a lot about that today in terms of what's happening. These rights are guaranteed, they're inherent because of they're God-given, and they're not supposed to be tampered with. And this was so radical because all the other rights from the European background were the king. The king, right. So this was very...
but the king didn't give us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
No. But here we are today over the years, and I guess when we figured out, I've been hosting for 15 years, that we figured out the other day,
well, it's at least 12, but it could be more, Dick.
It could be more. So, of course, you and I both noticed that there is a change. We used to have, especially now during election season, we would have politicians wanting to come on State of the State to get their message out. And we would call guests, other people that had current events, and they would want to come forward and use this as a platform. Today, it's harder and harder to do that, and I don't know why. And I think people ought to be aware. That's why you and I are spending time now. This is the third time we've done this kind of a back and forth. And so clearly we've seen a change. And I think part of it, John, is politicians today are really being packaged, because and I think the audience should know that very often when we invite a person running for office or an incumbent to come on the program, one of the first questions we get, not from them, but from their handler, is what questions are you going to ask them?
That's right.
And our answer is the same. We don't do that. We don't supply the questions in advance. We want spontaneous responses, and we're going to be fair in the questions and the way we ask them, but we're not going to give you the questions ahead of time. And then very frequently we'll get, there's a conflict with so-and-so. He can't make it or she can't make it, right?
That's right.
So, and the audience ought to be aware of that, because certainly we see that. And I think that's how politics and elections have changed. The incumbency has a great deal of power connected with it, not only
yes, indeed,
the ability to raise money, of course, but then they just want to hang on to power. And again, our founding fathers, I don't think ever thought that there would be a ruling political class, do you? I mean, I don't think that was ever the idea. I mean,
I don't believe that was ever their notion, Dick.
yeah. Although, I mean, the only way term limits for the president came into power, as you know, is after FDR, when he was elected for the first term, and the guy was deathly ill, he's terminally ill. Nevertheless, he got in there. And George Washington was asked after 2 terms to run again. And he said no. And that was like tradition established 2 terms for the president, but nothing else, you know?
And when this nation was about to begin, the members of the colonies, they were about half and half in terms of their positions, where it was going nowhere. But many of them were intelligent men, if not all, and they said, we can't agree, well, we can't disagree, we must come to some recognition of agreement so that we can begin this great experiment.
Right. And, they're gonna,
and they did.
Yeah, and the idea was checks and balances. So a lot of people say, well, why can't they just get along? Why can't? Because the system isn't built that way. The system is built for change to occur slowly. And initially, United States senators, yeah, they have 6-year terms, but they were actually appointed by the governor.
That's right.
And that changed later on to the popular vote. So in the last time you and I talked, the true democracy only exists for us voters with respect to electing people to the Congress. The president and vice president are elected through the Electoral College. So we are voting for people to represent us to cast a ballot for president or vice president. And of course, you know that the audience should know that that was the bone of contention in 2020, because the vice president has to certify the election of the president and vice president by the Electoral College.
And it's still a contention, I believe, Dick, among many voters who are no longer voting.
Yeah.
Because they're basically saying, but I vote, and then some other people have the last decision. So, you know, why waste my time about voting?
Well,
and of course, I would argue against that notion, but I think that in large measure it's contributing to the loss of older, more experienced voters.
And some of the younger ones too.
And some of the young ones too, of course.
Because you know this is not the right idea. And it was interesting because last night I saw like a give and take on a college campus, and this young woman was assailing a right-wing person on campus, and she's talking about democracy, and he said, wait a minute, democracy is not mentioned once anywhere in the Constitution, Bill of Rights, or anywhere in the documents of the Founding Fathers. In fact, the only time it's mentioned is as a warning. Now, I had a discussion, you know, along these lines with a person, an older voter, and they were talking about, I guess on the internet now, there's like a movement about, well, we can use artificial intelligence and all this other stuff. We can all vote. We'll vote for every bill and everything. I said, that's never worked. Pure democracy has never worked. And so now, all of a sudden, because people are talking about artificial intelligence and the power of computers, are people really going to sit down and vote on every bill and every item? And we're going to settle everything by popular vote of 350 million people, more or less, depending on if you want to count people here illegally. Is that what we're going to do? It's impossible.
It's not likely to happen, Dick, as you know, and as many people who are viewing this program as we are chatting here, is that many people have to work more than one job to make enough money to support themselves and their families, if they have families. And so our government has made us slaves, in a sense, to the need to have more than one job to make ends meet. And many of our American citizens are too exhausted to even begin to think about elections until the very last minute. But that's no way you approach voting conscientiously.
Right. Well, and frankly, today you talked about elections. The Constitution, both the state and federal, refers to an election day. Well, we don't have that anymore.
Not anymore.
On the way in, I was listening. I think I forget what state it is, but mail-in balloting was starting, and the host was talking about a state. I think it might be New Jersey. It starts like next month. Mm-hmm. And you can start voting in September. Well, I mean, the presidential candidates haven't debated. The vice presidential candidates haven't even debated yet. What are you voting on? What are you basing this on?
And we have a primary coming up
in Rhode Island.
In the next month.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting. We've had Pat Morgan came on. She's running against Sheldon Whitehouse. She's running as a Republican, but she's got a challenger in a gentleman named McKay.
That's correct.
And both of them, believe it or not, debated the other day on Channel 12 on their show, their talk show, political show. Mm-hmm. But you got to wonder, will a Republican ever get elected in Rhode Island again to general office? I mean, locally, yeah, there'll be some, towns and especially the rural areas that will send Republicans or have Republican leadership in the town. But yes, it's becoming rarer and rarer. So if a political party begins to take it for granted, then what happens is they just say, well, we can do whatever we want because there's no consequences for me.
It's not a good system.
No. So now let's switch. We're going to go on. We have so many things. When we started, I came for our pre-production meeting. I said, John, my head is exploding with all this stuff that's going on in the world.
Well, I guess, Dick, it's we're going to begin to have the benefit of your work in looking at different sources of information within the United States of America and beyond to really figure out what is going on in this world. And there are a couple of things that are happening outside of our own important elections. And maybe we should start, Dick, with the situation in Ukraine. And of course, there's been some very important things that have begun to happen where the Ukrainians are in the Soviet Union now. They've invaded the Soviet Union, and wow. So well, yeah. Can we start there?
Yeah. This whole situation is really kind of bizarre because I have not listened to, and I've listened to several military experts. They can't figure out what this is about. The Ukraine and some of the Ukrainian generals who have asked that question are now been discharged by Brzezinski. But they took 1,000 troops and sent them. Now the major Russian thrust is in the northeast corner of the country. And that's where they focus. And the Russians are moving very steadily in that direction. Mm-hmm. To take 1,000 of the troops they have left, and they invade the Kursk region of Russia, which is farther south. No one can figure out why. The Kursk, by the way, it's interesting. In World War II, that region was the site of the largest tank battle in history between the Germans and the Soviets. And so they probed in there, and they've got maps show some finger-like, but there's only 1,000 of them. And these are troops that they desperately need in the north where the Russians are advancing. Mm-hmm. So no one can figure out what they're doing, except that are they poking the bear a little bit more? And the risk is, I mean, Putin, they're just going to send some more troops down there and push them back because 1,000 is nothing. So no one knows what that's about. But the fact of the matter, we're just talking about the way we spend money in this country. The billions of dollars that we're shoveling into Ukraine, for what purpose? People think, oh, well, we're buying them munitions. A lot of the money is used to prop up the bureaucracy of the government and pay the pensions of pensioners.
Wow.
Yeah, and so we're sending these billions, and I mean, you look at what we need here in this country. I mean, I live in North Kingstown, which is a fairly well-to-do school system, and it's pretty well funded. I found out they have a person on the staff that goes around at this time of year to the church. The way I found out, they came to our church, and they go to other charitable places, churches and whatnot, and they're asking for us to donate a whole list of supplies: pencils, crayons, earbuds, backpacks. And I said to somebody, well, the person that's coordinating it at our church, and I said, what's going on? She said, oh yeah, they're doing this every year. And I said, why? Well, come to find out that almost all the school systems, maybe perhaps all of them, do send home to the parents at the start of every school year this list of things, supplies. Right. And they know that about probably 20% of the parents respond. And what they do is they take all that stuff and they put it in the supply closet. And then they dole it out throughout the year. Yes. I said, what do they need earbuds for? Well, because now all the kids have little, whatever they call them, compact little things. And they sit and they do their lesson. And so they don't interfere with each other. They put in earbuds. So we have to supply all this stuff.
And that has become a rather common practice throughout the state of Rhode Island in the various systems.
Yeah, and so we got to ask ourselves, we're sending these billions of dollars all over the world in places like Ukraine, and we can't even supply crayons and pencils to kids in elementary school here. Something's really got our priorities messed up.
I agree.
So, again, they're not really sure why this incursion. Somebody could argue, well, he's doing a two-front war, right? Well, he doesn't have enough troops. Their military is fairly well depleted in Ukraine. Putin is being very cautious going forward, but what's happening is NATO is making more and more overtures. People should be aware, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was formed after World War II in response to the Soviet Union. They held on to the territory they had captured at the end of World War II. They began to install puppet governments. And they made the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And those satellite countries formed the Warsaw Pact. So to offset that, we being primarily the United States, because we were the only ones that really could do it, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that said, okay, if you guys come after us, we're going to stand united. We're not going to do a little piecemeal. If you go into Belgium isn't going to stand alone. And that was the really reason for NATO. Yes. When the Soviet Union dissolved, there was no real reason for NATO to exist anymore. But like every bureaucracy, it's almost like an organism, organ that has all. It keeps growing. It's like an amoeba, and they don't want to give up. And so they began to talk about expanding NATO into the countries that used to form the Warsaw Pact. And Russia said, wait a minute, you can't come up to our border with NATO because we're going to see that as a threat. And it really started under the Clinton administration. They began to argue that we should expand NATO to include some of these former countries.
Dick, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
And I may be off base in asking this, but somehow I seem to recall that when NATO was formed, there was some agreement with the Soviet Union that what was created then would remain that way, that it would not be expanded.
Exactly.
Am I dreaming?
Yeah, especially with respect to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. Ukraine was the site of a large number of the nuclear missiles, the arsenal of Russia. And nobody wanted this and Ukraine's a large country. I mean, people don't realize how big it is. And in addition to being a great agricultural area, it was the site of a lot of these nuclear weapons. And Russia said, okay, we'll remove those. We'll let Ukraine become a neutral state. It must stay that way. NATO must not come in and bring Ukraine in, because we regard this as the buffer zone, because that's the way the Germans, when the Germans invaded Russia, and the invasions of Russia have always come up through Ukraine. And yet, what happened is there was now a group that said, well, we're going to continue to do this. There was a conference, this is when, I believe, when Clinton was still president, there was a conference at which time they said, well, we're going to expand NATO. And the president of France and the president of Germany said, bad idea. This is going to just provoke Russia. This is a bad idea. But nevertheless, this is what's happened. And now under the Biden, well, actually goes back to the Obama administrations when it really took off, when the CIA helped overthrow the last democratically elected government of Ukraine, and then installed really a puppet government, and it didn't get into NATO, and it still really isn't part of NATO, but if it would be a disaster, because Russia's not going to stand for that. But this NATO is now even going so far as to say they have an interest in protecting Taiwan. Well, what the heck does that have to do with the North Atlantic? But again, this is this idea that this body, which is just created in response to a threat, has now begun to reach out and saying, well, we got to get involved in the Pacific now, because China is a real threat. What? So this is a real problem. And people, I think the situation in Israel now is kind of pushed Ukraine to the back burner. But Ukraine can ignite very quickly. And if Russia is going to continue to move east until it reaches the point of Odessa and Kharkov, I think is the name of the other, and that will complete their control of the ethnically Russian part of the country. And Putin has said, hey, we can sit down, I'm willing to negotiate. Well, are we going to be willing to really be reasonable, or are we just looking at Putin as being the real bad guy? It seems now, John, that the focus is shifting in the Biden administration, particularly that Iran is really the bad guy we got to worry about. And now we're getting into the area of what's going on in Israel. And people, I think, are very, they're not really paying attention. And this is bringing us to the brink of war. Because Netanyahu is in trouble politically. There's an arrest warrant out for him as a war criminal that people don't really realize. When he came to the United States, there was an arrest warrant from the International Court of Criminal Justice. Obviously, they weren't going to make a move to arrest him in the United States. But we are sending a nuclear attack submarine armed with over 100 Tomahawk missiles.
We are in the process of doing that as we are speaking here.
Yep. So we have these carrier task forces. There's one left. The others have pulled away. But now Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has ordered 2 of them from the Pacific region to operate at flank speed, means top speed, and get into position. Now, naval authorities will say, and have said, that the Red Sea is the worst place you want to have a carrier task group, because they're too vulnerable. There's too many directions from which they can be attacked. And carrier task forces are a great way to project your power, but they're very vulnerable today to the modern weapons that exist. And you don't have to sink a carrier. All you have to do is disable its deck, and they can't land and take off planes. And therefore, it's just a floating piece of junk until they fix it. but there are, I was telling John this before the show, that there is a device called a wake torpedo. So not only do they have precision-guided missiles from the air, a wake torpedo is fired by a submarine at the wake of a carrier, and it can actually it goes at like between 90 and 100 knots. Now the carrier's top speed is 30 knots, but this thing can actually turn at 90-degree angles, and it focuses in and comes in on the bow of the carrier and goes underneath the carrier and explodes under there, and they call it breaking the back of the ship.
Wow.
And literally, the ship will break in half because of the architecture of it and sink within minutes. So, you know, after World War II, one of my favorite stories is, you know, General Billy Mitchell is a name some people might recognize. He said, hey, airplanes can sink battleships. And the Navy said, come on, the battleship, you know, it's impregnable. You can't sink up one of these dreadnoughts. And so they took some German battleships that had been captured, and Billy Mitchell went out there, and these are little putt-putt airplanes, and they sunk the battleships. Yeah. And the admiral said, well, that's not realistic because they weren't moving. Well,
they weren't moving.
Yeah. And Billy Mitchell was criticized for doing it. And so what happened at Pearl Harbor? Right. All our battleships were sunk.
Yeah, that's right.
And luckily, the two carriers we had were out on maneuvers, or we would have been in a world of hurt. So now all of a sudden, then the carrier becomes the capital ship. And now it's challenged a little bit, more than a little bit, by nuclear submarines that can go under and stay submerged for months if they have to, and carry devastating attack, you know, like it doesn't have to be nuclear or conventional weapons. Right. So the submarine is like now really taken over, but it's not as romantic to have some admirals on the deck of on an aircraft carrier watching the planes come in and out from his swivel chair, but he can't do that in a submarine very well, can he? And the submarines travel quietly underneath. They don't travel in wolf packs like the Germans did with their diesel-powered submarines. But you don't even have to be a nuclear submarine to launch one of these wake torpedoes at them. So
it seems that the more we attempt to solve problems in this era we're in now, the worse the problem becomes.
Yeah, John, I'm not an isolationist, but let me remind you and the audience. George Washington, our first president, the founder of this country, said, avoid foreign entanglements. Now, after World War II, we were the only really the superpower left with an intact industrial base and possession of this new terrible weapon, the atomic bomb, all right? Mm-hmm. So we were in a position where we could influence things that happened all over the world because of those powers. Russia, on the other hand, looked at us and said, well, I see you as a threat too. And they had the ability to create a nuclear weapon, or, you know, and it's escalated from there until we've had some reason come in and some limitation on the use of nuclear weapons.
Yes.
Most people are probably not familiar with something called the Samson option.
The Samson option.
In Israel, they have an option called the Samson option, which means when they feel that their existence is being threatened, they are going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Scott Ritter, who is a former UN weapons inspector, has said he believes that Israel has developed the so-called neutron bomb. And people may remember that phrase. The neutron bomb uses radiation more than blast and heat to destroy its target. Mm-hmm. And it can be limited, and it can destroy this area, but then within a week or 10 days, you can go back into the area and occupy it. And a lot of the buildings and stuff will be intact because it's not the blast or the heat that's going to, but certainly there's going to be a ton of casualties from those and the radiation exposure. Sure. So Israel, he says, he believes they have some of these in their arsenal already. So if they go ahead and retaliate, they feel like if Iran comes in and starts to really hit them hard, they want to knock out the Iranian nuclear capacity. There are analysts that say this is the reason that Netanyahu came to this country, to reinforce the idea that the United States will back whatever he wants to do in this area. And Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, has said flat out, we will support Israel. Now, does that mean that we're going to use our naval air power and these attack submarines with cruise missiles to try to knock out the Iranian underground facilities where these things are stored? The other thing that they're talking about is Israel talking about going north and really attacking Hezbollah. Well, Hezbollah and Hamas are financed by Iran, who got a lot of their money from the Biden administration when they came into power. $100 billion was released. We'll put that aside for a moment. Yeah. So, they're financing these. They're financing these terrorist groups, and I'm certainly not in favor of the terrorist groups. But on the other hand, I'm concerned that we are being led into a regional war by the government of Israel. And the latest poll that I just saw is that 47% of the people in Israel, the Jewish population of Israel, support exactly what's happening now and moving forward and going north. The IDF cannot fight a two-front war. Their generals have said they can't do it. So they're still fighting in Gaza, and they want to go in and try to fight into Lebanon, where they tried that before and got sent home with their tail between their legs. It's not a good situation at all.
Well, Dick, let me say this. It's one thing to have a big brother, but what happens when your big brother says, "Oh, I've had enough of this stuff"?
Well, that's. I think, to be honest with you, when Donald Trump says he can end this quickly, that's what he's talking about. All you have to do is say, "We're not giving you any more of this stuff," and the stuff that's in the pipeline is stopping. And we're not going to support your advances into Lebanon, and we're not going to support your attacks on Iran. Now, the Iranians may look at this and say, okay, the United States is now intervening, and we'll let the thing settle down. But that's not the direction, and Biden's in there for another 6 months. So I don't know what's going to happen. But another thing that people are not aware of is that 9 members of the Israeli Defense Force were arrested for torturing a Palestinian prisoner with electric rods in his private parts, and among other things. When the word got out that they had been arrested, the extreme right-wing groups in Israel went to the army place where they were being held and rioted, or basically protested, but it was a riot. And they finally got them out, brought them to another place. The group, they found out where they were. Now these 9 soldiers have disappeared. And the Knesset, their legislative body, proposed legislation that would exonerate them or hold them immune from these war crimes. There has been a lot of reports about the mistreatment of Palestinians that have been captured in Gaza, men and women. And this is the first one that really got some publicity to it. So when we look at this and say, well, Israel is responding to the attacks of October 7th, there's a thing in war called proportionality, right?
Yes.
And I think I said on the last show, there's another thing that the Israelis follow, which is called the Hannibal Protocol, which says that if their hostage situation takes place if you can kill the hostage taker, take the shot even if it means that the hostage is going to die. And on October 7th, there is mounting evidence that a substantial number of the people, the 1,200 or so reported as casualties, were caused by the Israeli Defense Forces going after the hostage takers. Mm-hmm. So, I always try to look at it through two sides, because I read a very good book a long time ago called Why Nations Go to War. And he talked about various wars and how these things build up. We've got to be very careful that we don't emphasize or take too much belief in the power of our military, because our military is not in good shape. The only service that has met its recruiting requirements for the last 3 years is the United States Marine Corps. The Army has fallen short over 40,000 for the last 3 years, and the Navy and the Air Force equally short.
Yeah, and I've heard that before.
Yeah. But the interesting thing, not interesting, the Army has focused on attracting female recruits. The number of female recruits has remained constant at about 10,000 a year. The difference between that and 40,000 plus are males between 18 and 24 that are not interested in going into the Army for a variety of reasons. But the Command Sergeant Major of the United States Army made a statement in an interview that I saw the other day that said, he said, I've seen a lot of combat, but I've never been into a war. Because he points out that the United States military has never faced a peer military force since World War II. And if you think about it, that's true. All our wars have been proxy wars.
Yes.
He said, basically, I'm not sure we're ready to do that. And he said, if people want to see what I'm talking about, he suggested watching the TV series that was called The Pacific. You could watch others. The Band of Brothers is a good one to watch as well, because that shows what war is like in terms of peer militaries clashing on the battlefield. Yeah. So I don't know how much time we have left, John. We're having a heck of a time. Oh, we got some time. Okay, so so I think the military is in real trouble, and not only the Command Sergeant Major, but other people have commented on the lack of preparation. And the fact is, we are depleting our reserve stores of things like artillery shells and so forth, so that we do not have the manufacturing capacity to replace them rapidly. The naval expert that I was listening to was also talking about, yes, we have a lot of these nuclear aircraft carriers. They do not have enough of in their groups, they don't have enough ships to screen them properly. They don't have enough crew on those. They're not fully manned. And a lot of them are in for repairs, because they do, even though they're nuclear powered, they do have to undergo periodic maintenance.
I would think.
Yeah. So by ordering, for example, these 2 carrier battle groups out of the Pacific at flank speed says something about the fact we may have 11 or 12 of these groups, but certainly we don't have a lot. There's not a lot of firepower that's like in reserve. If they're sitting in a shipyard for repairs, they're not available for combat. And so I don't know where this is going to go.
Well, Dick, I have a question as it relates to this, I believe, and that is, it seems as though, we get involved with one thing, and then there's another thing, and then yet another thing. And it would seem to me that there may be some forces in this world who are just counting, how many different places in the world we're involved, and they're waiting for an opportunity to figure out, well, now they're overloaded.
Yep. Yeah, it could very well. Vladimir Putin, despite what people think, Russia has no designs to go into Western Europe and take over. They did that, been there, done that. Western Europe, their economies are a disaster. And the only leader in Western Europe now is the newly elected woman who was elected to run Italy. All the others they're all in trouble politically at home, all around the place. And clearly, the United States is the only force that is capable of influencing the direction of a war, because, yeah, we have NATO, but these other countries don't have anything, and a lot of them rely on our weaponry.
That's right.
We sell them the stuff, and, you know, then it has to be maintained, which is great for the military-industrial complex. You know, one of my people think I'm maybe crazy, but to me, one of the great presidents was Eisenhower.
Yes, indeed, and I know what you're going to say.
In 1961, in his farewell address, now you're talking about a guy who was a 5-star general.
That's right.
Who was in command of the invasion of all the forces involved in the invasion of Northern Europe. Yep. And he warned against the military-industrial complex. Yes, and people have to remember that every time Congress appropriates money for Ukraine, for Israel, that's money in the bank for the the industrial side, the defense industry. We're great at producing weaponry. We clearly are. But all of our other manufacturing is mostly offshore now. Or they're trying to get some of it back. In Mexico, of course, is a big partner in that. But those days when we could have the ability to supply all of our allies like we did in World War II, those days are gone. When you think about what we did, John, we're a nation of about 160 million, and 16 million men and some women went off in the military, yeah. And the rest of us, I was a baby, oh. You know,
my father,
yeah, they actually provided all the materiel, not only for us, but for our allies, including Russia, Great Britain, China, you know, and fought two separate wars. The Pacific and the European War were two different really wars, but in two different enemies. And we did all that. We built thousands of ships, airplanes, tanks, guns, and we not only for ourselves, but we gave them away, lend lease, whatever you want to call it. But
if I may add that, and after the war was over, we spent a substantial amount of our money to rebuild Europe.
Yeah, the Marshall Plan. And what happened with Japan? The Korean War was a boon to Japan because Japan became the launching point for the Korean War.
Yes.
And will somebody please tell me why we still have 28,000 troops sitting in Korea when the thing ended in 1951? 53, no, 51, I guess. No, 52. South Korea is a prosperous economy that has its own defense force, and yet we're keeping troops there. And why do we have troops all over? We have troops at in 200 locations around the globe. And if you notice, I forget which expert I was listening to, people don't realize there have been 220 attacks on American service personnel and installations in the Middle East since the Biden administration. 220. Now, we don't hear about many. You know how many we responded to?
We don't hear about many of them, but...
Well, do you know how many we responded to? 10.
10.
Out of 220 attacks, we've responded to 10. And sure...
So what does that tell others who want to attack us? That we're sitting ducks.
Yeah. So exactly. Why are we sitting there in Syria, especially places like that? Why? They say, well, we have that. That gives us a listening post. Well, that's great. If you hear something, what are you going to do about it? You know, if you don't have the resources to do anything, we don't have the military to do it. Yeah. So we can talk a bit about the influence of this on our national election, because you and I both know that people like Iran, Russia, China are looking at what's happening here, and we have a campaign.
Let's do that, Dick. We have a little less than 10 minutes, but
okay.
let's talk about that.
I can remember, I don't really remember too much about the first presidential recollection I had was as a child when Truman was running on his own. You know, he had replaced FDR upon FDR's death. But I can remember being taken to the train station by my parents, and Truman had a train, and on the back of the car, he came out and he talked to the people assembled at the train station.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, that's my first recollection of it, right? And then now we're into the age of, well, okay, they say that, you know, Kennedy mastered television. They say that Reagan also mastered the verbal and communication with people because of his acting background. Trump was the first one that really was able to use social media. Now he's blocked on just about everything except X, formerly known as Twitter. But the influence of these social media platforms and so forth cannot be overstated or understated, because
That's right.
so many of the young people today get most of their information, they'll acknowledge it, from TikTok, Instagram, you know, all these different things that anybody can post anything. It doesn't have to be true. And now we have a situation where when Joe Biden was named as the presidential candidate for the Democrats, we were in the midst of this COVID crisis. I almost said hysteria, which is what it really was. And they were able to conceal him pretty much out of public eye, a basement campaign. He would come out to talk to friendly media and go to a few places that were very friendly to Democrats. Now it seems that this year, with Joe Biden being removed from, being taken off the ticket basically by the party leadership, Kamala Harris is really being shielded from the press to a large extent. She hasn't given a press conference since before she was a candidate, really. Mm-hmm. When she goes places now, she's reading off of the teleprompter, pretty much staying on script. The press corps that's been assigned to her, she doesn't even talk to them. She ignores them, walks away from them. And all the candidates have a group of pool reporters that are assigned to them. She doesn't talk to them. Now, her running mate seems to be trying to get out there a little bit more. But what's happening is, even though there is evidence of their political positions for years, we're now being told that, no, that's not who they are.
That's not true.
Yeah, and they're actually, some of their statements are being taken off of social media, so you can't find it.
Yes.
But their positions are so far out on the left that I think some of it is, they say that she's left of Bernie Sanders, which is saying something. And I don't think the American people are really that far left. I think we're more of a centrist type of organization or culture, society. But yet, we talked about the change in politics. This is all about branding the candidate. It's a brand now. And maintaining this image and putting them forward as you would a new product, a new branded cereal or something. This is who they are. Yeah. And forget about the other stuff.
Yeah, they get a new hat and coat, and they're different human beings.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, Trump is Trump. His running mate seems to be a young man who certainly is a success story, coming up out of the background he did and making a success of himself and becoming a United States Senator. They say he had, but not for long, but neither was Barack Obama. He didn't finish his first term either. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens, John. I don't know. I think also, I mean, we got to be well aware, as we said, that we are now in a system that has an election season, not just an election day, a voting season. And about 70% of the votes are cast before Election Day.
Yes.
So if the Republicans don't get on the ball and get the vote out early, like the Democrats do, it's too late.
Yeah. You were talking about the role that social media is playing. I found out that the Ukrainians were in Russia from one of my grandsons.
Yeah.
And when he told me that, and he's pretty, I mean, he is one of these very savvy individuals. And, you know, after he explained what he found out was going on, I said, well, I got to give Dick August a call and find out. I wonder if he knows.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and the youngsters, the younger folks, that's where they get most of their information from.
Yep. And I mean, people wonder, well, where am I getting the things I'm talking about? I want people, again, I want to reemphasize, I do not support terrorism, okay? And I'm not anti-Semitic. But I think you have to look at what's happening and what might bring us into very serious consequences.
And Dick, that is a very serious concern that I believe many Americans have. I mean, I have friends and relatives, and just about every one of them has brought up, where are we going with this?
Yeah. You know, I mentioned this former UN inspector, Scott Ritter. He speaks Russian, and I know he went to Russia to really, this is going back maybe a year and a half, he went there to see what the effects of the sanctions, the Biden administration keeps talking about the sanctions and how Russia's suffering because of it. So he is a Russian speaker, and he went out, he didn't go to Moscow, he went there, but then he went out to different cities around the country. And he said, there's no problems there. The shelves are stocked because Russia's found new trading partners. They're not relying on us anymore, or the Western Europeans. What happened was when he returned home at Kennedy Airport, he was met by, I guess, Homeland Security. They seized his passport. And 2 or 3 days ago, the FBI raided his house and executed a search warrant. And he said, I have nothing against the FBI agents. They're very polite. They gave me a copy of the warrant. They gave me a receipt for everything they took. But they took all of his electronic media because the government wants to find out who he's been talking to.
Sure.
John, this is very scary. When we talked about the Bill of Rights, what happened to freedom of speech?
Yes, it is. Well, Dick, we have just less than 2 minutes remaining. And so as much as I hate to do this to you, we're going to have to wrap it up. And I have to tell you publicly that this has been a very informative, and of course I'm not surprised when it comes from you. And there are many, many important aspects to begin thinking about if we haven't begun to think about them already.
Yeah, and I would add, John, for political candidates and elected officials that we invite on this program, we may not give you the questions we're going to ask. We can give you some general directions we're going to go. But I think our policy is to try to treat all candidates fairly. And the questions may not be the easiest questions you face, and we've had people tell us that they weren't the easiest questions, but they're not intended to be hostile or try to tear you down. We want to invite you to come on, and so the people can understand your position on the issues.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you, viewers, for watching State of the State. And please join us again next time for the next edition of State of the State.